Hi there, and welcome to the Markets UK podcast. My name's Nick Shepley, and I will be your host for the next 10 minutes, bringing you a weekly diet of economics, politics, history, comment, and other miscellaneous odds and ends. And really, the purpose of today's podcast is to try to help us all get beyond the idea of the conspiracy theory. There are, in essence, no need for conspiracy theories when epic crimes and wrongdoings are in the newspapers every single day and they're all perfectly explainable. In 2 or 3 decades' time, the population of much of the world will look at the past 5 years as a revolutionary watershed in attitudes. Something fundamental has taken place in the thoughts and the opinions of most of the population. Prior to 2008, the banks were something to be moaned about but tolerated, much like tax collectors, religious callers, and novelty ringtones, as inevitable part of modern life that had to be endured. The financial crisis has torn those assumptions to shreds in the eyes of many. Banks and the global financial system, with the connivance of powerful political elites, have operated for decades at a level far beyond anything that could be described as a nuisance or a burden. It now transpires that many of them have operated in ways that would have seen most individuals receive hefty jail sentences. Readers of this blog and listeners to this post who conclude that the financial system is literally a ruling class of its own, operating, as all ruling classes do, to further its interests at the expense of others, would be justified in these thoughts. As I just said, I don't subscribe to conspiracy theories, as they are what people use when evidence is lacking, but in this instance there's no shortage of evidence. There's evidence of widespread fraud, manipulation of interest rates, money laundering, involvement in the worldwide drugs trade, and the use and abuse of vast, incalculable quantities of public money. All this is common knowledge. It's not the stuff of cranks and paranoid fantasists. That's why an immense cultural change, one which will shape the 21st century people we become, distinct from our 20th century forebears, is underway. Our new economic reality began in 2008, or that's at least when we woke up to it, and everything we learned over the following 5 years can be summed up in the following points. 1. Banks want your money, but are willing to give next to nothing in return. 2. Banks exist beyond the control of national governments and can operate outside the law when it suits them and largely with impunity. 3. Banks and governments often collude together against the interests of the populations they notionally serve. Banks are the new feudal robber barons, unelected satraps, dominating the financial world that we inhabit, offering us little or no choice but to accept the conditions that they offer. Well, how did we get here? As I mentioned, again, I'm not a fan of conspiracy theories, and the truth of how we reached the point of total strangulation by finance is actually more mundane than one might think. I'd love for everything to be a bit more like a Bond movie, but it just isn't. The Western world embraced a peculiar doctrine in the 1970s, one based on a series of wild assumptions about the human condition, the way in which markets operate, and how best to marry free markets and individual liberties together. That doctrine can be loosely summarized as neoliberalism. This is not a new idea, it is one oft mentioned. The reintroduction of the kinds of liberal economic values that prevailed in the 19th century and the deliberate downgrading of the state as a tool for change. As Ronald Reagan put it, in the present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem. All this seemed like common sense 3 decades ago. The kind of government that we had created on both sides of the Atlantic to deal with the Great Depression, to galvanise entire populations of Britain, America, Canada and beyond, to see off the threats of Nazism, Italian fascism and Japanese imperialism, and then build welfare states created to curtail communism's appeal, all seemed woefully clunky and out of date by about 1980. What was worse was that they were expensive in a time of rising oil prices and declining economic output. The Thatcher-Reagan consensus told us that economies had to be run like well-managed corner shops, that they had to keep a balanced budget, and much of what we had been able to afford in the past was now no longer affordable. Much of this was ostensibly true. If the state is a wealth consumer, though it is not quite fair to say that it fails to produce any wealth at all. The right-wing ideologues such as Donald Trump and Herman Cain that consumed so much oxygen during the recent US presidential campaign decrying the state and its evils tended to conveniently ignore the fact that the state still educates their workers and their contribution to that in terms of taxes is vastly lower than if they paid for it themselves. It seems astonishing that in the USA, where the state provides for and defends a standard of life that is still superior to much of the population of the world, that so many should see it as a threat to their well-being. One of the less publicised outcomes of the 1980s was the unfettering of finance, a system that had been lightly but effectively regulated since the 1930s, and if anyone read last week's blog or listened to last week's podcast, we were talking about the Glass-Steagall Act, and it was the Glass-Steagall Act that came under attack throughout the 1980s until gradually it was repealed by Bill Clinton in the 1990s. In Britain, the stock market was deregulated in 1986, with fixed commissions being eliminated and computers brought in. The speed and the value of trade skyrocketed, and worried brokerages in New York demanded the repeal of Glass-Steagall to compete with London. The British had always had an informal method of keeping the high street and casino banking arms of finance separate. It was called British snobbery. British city gents did not touch vulgar high street deposits or drink in the same clubs as ordinary bankers. Not until the Big Bang, that is. After the shock deregulation of the system, they were keen to fuel their newfound freedom with whatever funds came to hand, and they were also at liberty to take whatever risks they saw fit. It is hardly a coincidence that within a year of the Big Bang, Britain experienced its first stock market crash since 1929, the direct result of a massively overheated and overvalued market. We still have the same model, and despite the crash of 2008, which dwarfed 1987 in its proportions, nothing has really changed, and no one has any idea how to tame finance or what to replace it with. No one, except me, of course. And I draw my inspiration from a TV show about Merlin a few years ago. In it, Merlin's evil foe was the fairy queen Mab, who relied on people believing in her in order to be powerful. When people withdrew their belief, she withered and died. No one believes the cosy story that the banks tell us anymore. They know it's a fraud. All the singing and dancing Halifax adverts in the world won't change the basic belief that most of us have in the banks, that they are institutions that are there to work against us as much as possible. But this knowledge is not enough. It is insufficient just to be right and to know that we are dealing with dangerous institutions. The trick is to shrink them back down to size. How do we do that in this age of bank supremacy? Through real investing. Moving money out of the banking system and into tangible, FSA-approved assets that represent real security against banking itself. Whenever the choice arises between assets and paper money, go with assets every single time. There's no time quite as ideal as now to invest either. With the base rate running several points below inflation, if you have money in a savings account, by the time you've listened to this podcast, you have become poorer. And your bank doesn't care. They don't have to. The only person that can secure your future and restore a bit of sanity to the financial system is you. The banks won't, the governments can't, so you and I must. Thanks very much for listening.